Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the best tips and practice for global expansion in 2025 and the coming years, brought to you by Serviap Global. In our company, international expansion is the front and center of our service. We provide employee of record service, which is hiring professionals throughout international entities on behalf of other companies, taking care of compliance and other administrative matters in the process. We also support companies with contractor hiring, global talent acquisition, and payroll process outsourcing. I'm so excited to present to you, to representing Serviap Global here today for this great opportunity at Serviap Global. We are committed to providing top-tier service and focus on continuous innovation, so I can't wait to learn more about global expansion, insights, and trends. This, lead, this leads me to present to you our speaker for today's webinar, Aaron McDaniel. Aaron is a globally recognized corporate manager, teacher, and speaker with passion for helping companies innovate at a global scale. He is also co-founder of the Wall Street Journal and national bestseller Global Class, a playbook for how to build a global company developed through interviewing more than 300 executives over 50 countries. Aaron is currently a faculty member at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business and is the co-founder of the 10X Innovative Lab. He is also managing partner at Growth Scale at a real estate private equity firm. Furthermore, Aaron is a published author. Some of his works include The Young Professional Guide to the Working World and The Young Professional Guide to Management, so don't miss out on them. He is also today to discuss what's been driving business growth around the world. We will meet new market opportunities, learn about common global leadership mistakes, discover the proper ways to prepare any company to compete globally, and access how one can leverage artificial intelligence in the international expansion. My name is Karina Guevara. I'm Revenue Coordinator at Serviap Global, and I'd like to kindly welcome Aaron McDaniel. Aaron, please take the stage.
Thanks, Karina. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody today. So in the research that Karina mentioned for the book that we recently wrote, we found in interviewing all of these executives that they all said they basically made things up as they went along and wasted a lot of time and money in the process, which really delayed or sometimes caused the failure of their international growth initiatives. And so we created a lot of structure and framework to take these best practices and help companies succeed and not make these same mistakes. So one parallel to think about for those of you that are familiar with the lean methodology or agile, there are certain structures like product market fit and minimum viable product MVP or pivoting, changing. And those structures allow for more easily communicating some of these core concepts across an organization to get alignment. And so we created some of those concepts as well as it relates to international expansion that I'll share with you a bit today. And so what we'll review in terms of these must-knows for global expansion in 2025, it includes mistakes not to make, as well as more effective strategies to help you be more successful. So, so why is now a great time to expand globally? Well, some may feel it's a bit of a contrarian view given how a lot of countries are being a little bit more nationalistic, putting up borders. There's a tariff war that's going on, and that can cause some challenges, but it also means that a lot of companies are not focused on international, and often those that take advantage when no one is paying attention are the ones who can really benefit. There's a lot of emerging markets out there. There's tons of opportunity. In sub-Saharan Africa, as an example, there are over 500 million people that are under the age of 19, and that number within the next 15, 20 years is going to be over 1 billion. And when you look at growth drivers for companies, there tends to be three. It's either new products and services, new customer segments, or new markets. If you are looking to change the value of your business in a big way, scale by 2, 3, 4, 5x, 10x your current value, really international expansion is one of the only ways to do that. It is very hard to find another product that can make you increase your company's value by 5x. It is very hard to find another customer segment that can help you increase your company's value by 5x. But there's a whole world out there and lots of opportunities to take advantage of these new new markets. The other thing that we found about these most successful companies who are effective in reaching global scale, they had what we called a global class mindset. And one of the elements of that mindset was around talent. So legacy-minded companies say, we are going to find the most talented people who happen to be located near where we have an office. Whereas the most successful companies with this global class mindset, they say we're going to identify the best talent wherever they happen to be and leverage them not just for their functional expertise, but also for their local expertise, their knowledge of local markets. And so when you start to build a global team, it really helps you unlock that opportunity. And I say this kind of jokingly, but the reference point I make to the shift that's happening with companies today, let's go back to the 1990s, right, with the first dot-com boom. And during that time, companies would have this big debate. These executives would say, should we build a website? Now, of course, everyone today has a website. And we think that's the mindset, that same analogy is what companies are going to look like in 5 or 10 years. Instead of saying, should we go global? They're going to say, of course we're global. We have employees everywhere. We have customers everywhere. And so architecting your company and thinking about the right way to effectively approach reaching global scale is an important thing to do. And so, what are some of the common mistakes companies make when expanding to new markets? So, first is over indexing on market potential, thinking about the market attractiveness or the market size. Just because there's a big opportunity doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best place to go. One concept that we'll talk about a little bit is this notion of an ability to win. So let's say you and your company had an opportunity to get a football team, a soccer team together and play against the Brazilian national team or the national team in the country that you're in, right? Well, just because you have that opportunity does not necessarily automatically mean you have the ability to win in that scenario. And so there's more things to think about, and we'll talk about some of those elements. So it's not just about the market opportunity. Um, the other mistake that companies often make is thinking about markets one by one. So the old mistake companies used to make was prioritizing the company way or the way that things are done in their initial market, their headquarter market. And I think a lot of us understand you can't just take one product and service and universally in every way be able to expand it across the globe. We understand there's a level of localization. So most companies don't make that mistake anymore. But often they make the mistake at the other end of the spectrum, which is, all right, we chose this market. We're going to go to China. And now we're going to do everything we need to do in order to get product market fit in China. Okay, now we want to go to Japan. Now we're going to do everything we need to do to get product market fit in Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And so what ends up happening is that when you think about these markets independently, after you enter a few, you hit a wall and you realize, oh no, we just created 10 different businesses that are really hard to manage at scale. And that's what happens when you think about each one individually, instead of thinking about a pathway to global growth, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Thinking more about scalability, thinking more about creating momentum, instead of just success in an individual market. The other thing, along that lines of ability to win, companies don't think about their organizational capability. They focus on, okay, big market opportunity. We were successful at home. Now we're gonna, go and figure that out internationally. And they don't think about whether there's alignment amongst their organizational team around those three drivers to growth. They don't necessarily realize whether they have some of the expertise they need to expand, local expertise as well as just international scaling expertise. They often also are not great at building a playbook to create that institutional knowledge to help them expand in many different markets at once. So here's a better way to look at things. If you look at the chart on the left, we call this our global growth opportunity matrix or GGO matrix. And it thinks about the three different elements that are important when evaluating new markets. So it's not just market opportunity or market attractiveness, which is the size of the circle, and the size will depend on how big that market opportunity is, or how attractive, I should say, that market is based on your criteria. Every company has their own custom criteria when they look at markets. Size of the bubble depends on that. But it's really these other two axes that matter a lot. The y-axis, which is your organizational capability. We have an assessment we call our global capability score, which helps you determine essentially how aligned you are in international expansion and whether you have the right global class mindset that companies who have been successful have. And so, depending on how high that number is on that x-axis, the size of the green box will be bigger or smaller. The higher your score, the higher ability there is to capture more markets. And so, therefore, the green box is bigger versus smaller. And then finally, there's that x axis on the bottom. And that evaluates market accessibility. In other words, how much do you need to change your go to market or operational models in order to be successful in a new market? And so, just because there's a big opportunity doesn't mean that you can easily just implement your same strategy where you're already operating. You often maybe need to make drastic changes. Um, and so we visualize that capability, or excuse me, that market accessibility by looking at the complexity that comes along with expanding. And so if you look at the spider chart on the bottom right, that's part of what we call our localization premium analysis. We use the word localization premium to talk about the complexity that comes along with localizing for a new market. And we use the word premium because there's a cost associated with localizing, but a benefit that you get as well. And so often, if you don't take the time to visualize this and think about all aspects, different executives on the team are biased toward one specific area. So the chief revenue officer, head of sales will say, well, we already have this distribution partner we're working with at home, and they're already in this other country, so we should go there. Or, chief legal counsel will say, well, this is the easiest from a regulatory perspective to go to. We should go there. And, maybe the CEO says, he or she says, I studied abroad in this country when I was in college and we should go there. There's all these reasons, but this sort of cuts through all of this and looks at it holistically. The premiums on the top, marketing, sales, and product, have to do with go to market changes. And then the bottom part, administrative, organizational, and infrastructure, have to do with operational changes. And we often use an iceberg analogy because companies often think about that top part. They think, okay, let's change to the local currency, change, to the local language, and change to marketing messages, and we're localized. But there's so much under the surface at the bottom of that iceberg that companies often don't think about, and they don't learn it until they're already in market, when it becomes very costly to make those mistakes. And so when thinking about it, tying all of these things together, as you can see from this chart, we're not just looking at one market at once. We're looking at a sequence of markets. We're looking at many different markets. And so when you understand your organizational capabilities and the attractiveness of a market, and then you layer on this notion of the accessibility of that market, you can identify different linkages that exist between markets. So it might be that a localization for market D here might also be able to be used in market H or G. And so it helps you determine what markets to prioritize and what localizations, what changes to make that then can be scaled in multiple places. And so it helps you figure out that right sequence to global growth, and really enables you to be able to launch in multiple markets at once if that's what your company chooses, instead of needing to go to one market, wait 2 years, do another market, wait a year or two more, do another market, because it often takes much longer than you'd expect to get traction in a new market. And the other part of this spider chart in the bottom right is this notion of ability to win. And so when we work with our consulting clients, we help them go department by department and think about the people, process, and platform that's in place to enable some of the localizations that new markets would require. And so, if, for example, the marketing team has never ever been to, nobody on the team has ever been to the country that you're targeting, that people rating parts of things would be low. And so you compare how accessible a market is, how much you need to change versus your capability to do so. And then it becomes a lot easier to determine where we need to focus specifically on hiring different types of people, where we need to focus on building certain structures and platforms in order to support the changes that are needed to successfully expand in new markets. So often what happens, as I was alluding to before, is a mistake companies make is they rush into launching in a market. The best analogy I can think of is if you've ever been part of a group scavenger hunt. You have a list of things to go find. A lot of teams will just start running. All right, and go. Let's read the first clue and let's go. What I've found in experience, both on these teams and observing these teams, is the teams that win tend to just take a couple minutes to take a step back and put a little structure to how they plan to attack this scavenger hunt. And they might be a little slower to start, but in the long run, they're very successful. If you're familiar with the fairy tale, the tortoise and the hare, the turtle and the rabbit, it's not about how quick you take off, it's about winning the race at the end. And so it's not about rushing to market. It's and it's not just about market research, but it's about this concept we call market discovery. And so that's not just understanding some of the data points of the market, but it's also understanding how you need to change your go-to-market and operational models to succeed in that market, which relates to some of the items that I just talked about on this previous slide. The other mistake once you get in market is when executives start measuring profitability too soon. The best analogy to think about is when you are just starting a company for the first time. For those familiar with being at early stage at a company, you have a lot of questions. You're figuring out who are our customers? How do we make money? What is our product exactly? How do we go to market? And you kind of have to do that over again in every single market that you enter. And so, if you are attempting to immediately launch and start thinking about revenue or profitability within a market, you're setting yourself up for failure. And often, what the mistake companies make is the executive team starts looking at these mature market metrics very early on. And then they go, we're not getting profit or revenue is not growing very fast. And then they pull back. So they invest money at the beginning, they don't see the traction, then they pull back and aren't successful and then ultimately have a failed international expansion initiative. So what's better is to build a series of metrics that adapt as you reach certain milestones. And those tend to be a little more qualitative to start. It might be around a milestone, might be around getting a certain regulatory licensing or something like that. It might be around a certain partnership that's formed. It might be things that are a little bit, again, more qualitative than just a certain revenue or profitability goal. The other thing that companies do, as mentioned, is they look at markets one at a time, or they treat this process of evaluating markets as a one-time exercise. Okay, we looked at this market, great. All right, now we're going to go launch here and we'll pick this up later, maybe in 6 months or 9 months or a year or 2 years. We'll look at markets again instead of looking at it more regularly. And part of the reason it's important to look at things more regularly is these markets aren't static, they're changing. Not just looking at the numbers of population or other key metrics today, but how they might be adapting over time and how that might be creating different opportunities. So it's really important to look at these dynamically regularly. And that's a great thing that we'll talk about how AI can be very helpful in helping you keep a pulse on what's happening in the market. I recall talking to an expansion leader who had launched a number of businesses in Korea and was going to launch with another company, the Korean market, after not launching in a couple of years. And he made the point, like, things could completely have changed. We need to keep a pulse on things. You can't just assume things are the same the last time you did an evaluation or last time with another company you attempted to launch there. So this prioritization exercise and understanding what's happening in the market needs to be an ongoing thing so you can take advantage of the best opportunity. So what is the best way to go about competing locally? Well, one thing you don't want to do is just assume that market size equals success, as we talked about before. We label that as whale hunting, right? You just go, we're going to go after the biggest markets there is. And if you think about it, just to use an analogy to put this in the context, or use an example to put this in the context, think about how many fast-growing companies have been successful recently in both the US and China. Two of them, for a lot of markets, are the biggest in the world, but they're so different than each other. That accessibility part puts them so differently that it is very hard to be successful in both. So if you look just purely at market size, you would think about, these being great opportunities. But when you layer on those other things like organizational capability, like market accessibility, the picture changes a little bit and it helps determine a better prioritization. When it comes to market selection, a couple other mistakes companies also make is around what we call familiarity bias. So companies will assume that just because they speak the same language in another country or they're geographically nearby, that that automatically means that it's the right market for them to be focusing on. And that doesn't always happen. So a US example we've seen with some of our American clients is they go, we're going to go to UK, then we're going to go to Australia. And then they start talking about wanting to go to New Zealand, looking at all of these English speaking countries. And I love New Zealand. I've traveled there. It's a great country, but there are bigger opportunities out there than just following the language piece of things. It also happens regionally where companies think, okay, we're just going to stick in a certain region. And sometimes, depending on your market, even similarities in culture might not be accounting for a lot of the changes that or differences there might be in a market. Another thing, and this is specific for companies that are focused on selling to other businesses, especially mid-tier and enterprise businesses, is that they focus too much on organic growth without truly understanding the market. So this is typically how this happens. Let's say you have a client that's headquartered in your headquartered country, and they love your product. And they go, well, we also have an office in London or in Singapore or wherever, and we would like to have our employees and our team there use your solution as well. And so you get really excited. You're like, this is a great opportunity. And then you build a solution that is great for that client. Well, what you're not doing is understanding whether what that client is asking for is truly what is needed throughout the whole market or just that one client. And so we've seen a number of companies who create that custom solution, but they didn't fully understand the market. And so it's very hard for them to capture additional opportunity with other clients that are located in that market because they were focused just on what their current clients' needs were in the market. So don't think about those ways. Think in the more dynamic pathway that we were talking about. Another important thing is around alignment and communication. So what we have found typically is that if international expansion is not, new markets is not the top priority of those three, it's very hard for companies to be successful because what ends up happening is that, let's say you're focused on new products. Well, you go to the product team and say, hey, we need to localize for this market. And they say, yeah, that's fine. Because you haven't operated in a lot of countries, these other markets represent a very small percent of revenue. And they say, well, I have my roadmap and all of our revenue is coming from our headquarters country. So we need to focus there. And so, unless it's really determined that this is a top priority, other things step in the way and it leads to less success. The other thing is to have a clear, what we call an expansion philosophy. And so often what happens is companies don't state that ultimate vision or what's the most paramount North Star in guiding international expansion. And what I mean by that is saying something like, we're only going to enter markets where we're going to be the number one or number two player, or we want to completely blanket this one region before we start looking outside of that, or we're only going to look at markets that have more than 50 million people population wise. And so the reason this expansion philosophy is important is because business happens. Things come up. There are shiny objects. We had one client who the president of a country tweeted on Twitter, on X, that company should launch in that country. And all of a sudden, they were like, oh, of course, we should go to this country. Well, when you take a step back and look at it and you align on the expansion philosophy, that country did not fit the parameters of that guiding light that they had. And so we were able to help, that type of framing helps you pull them back to say, let's make sure that we're looking at markets that are aligned with that ultimate vision. So let's talk a little bit more about the right and wrong way to be approaching expansion. So, as mentioned, market research is great, but what's more important is what we label as market discovery. And so that's not just looking at a report, but actually going in market to truly understand things. I'll give a story that came from the research for our book. Evernote, the note taking app, was looking at expanding into India. And for them, their payment processing in the US, where they're headquartered, had always been credit cards. And so they did desk research. Troy Malone, their head of international, did desk research and found that credit card penetration was very high amongst their target segment, which for them was going to be the upwardly mobile young professional segment. And so it looked really good. But then Troy went into market and just started talking to people, including like Uber drivers, taxi drivers, people at restaurants. And he said everybody had an auntie story. Everyone had the story of that an aunt or uncle had told them about another family member who got a credit card, racked up a bunch of debt, and ruined their life. So ultimately, everyone had credit cards, just culturally they were too scared to use them because of all these stories they heard. So if Evernote had gone into market with that payment processing, they wouldn't have been successful. But because of that on the ground understanding, they were able to identify a better way to do things. Another great example that came from Troy in India was they were looking for new marketing tactics. And he was literally on the street in this business district, and he noticed that there were groups of people that were walking down the street with long boards that had a bunch of buckets on the top of them in the middle of the day. And he asked a local new hire that they had brought in, he said, "What's happening there?" And they're like, those are the dabiwalas. Those are the people that are delivering lunches and to all of the white collar workers in this area. And Troy thought, well, this is perfect. And ended up developing a flyer that they put in all of the different lunches that were then delivered to these people. Now, we typically think of things like social media advertising or even like a billboard. But when you truly go into a market, then you really understand where the opportunity lies. Also, as I was referencing, it's not thinking about each market individually and then hitting that wall after you enter a few, but it's using things like the global growth opportunity matrix, the GGO matrix I talked about before, to think about parallelization opportunities, to think about localizations that can be scaled in different places. To give another example, Airbnb was looking to expand into Asia. And so as they were doing that, they were looking in particular at China, Japan, and Korea. So if you typically looked at the size of the market, mistake that we talked about a lot of companies making, they would say, well, China's the biggest market population-wise, let's go there. Or Japan is the most developed economy out of all those, GDP per capita, let's go there. But in understanding the market and doing discovery, they learned that Korea was an influencer market for Japan and China. That a lot of Japanese and Chinese consumers in the travel space looked to Korean influencers for the latest thing. And so they localized for Korea first and built a lot around their model. And it made it very easy for them to scale and build momentum in the region and to go into Japan and China after because they created that foundation. And a lot of those localizations they did in one market could be used in the other markets. And then metrics and milestones. So as I talked about, you don't want to jump right into profitability or revenue. You want to think about other more important things and think about not just launching in a market, but reaching product market fit. And we found a lot of companies, they understand how to launch, but actually scaling is where there's a lot of structure that's lacking. And so a tool we use, we call the product market fit tracker. It helps outline various milestones and how the metrics change over time. And I mentioned some milestones before, but it's important to create custom milestones that fit best for your company. A case study that we use is within Uber. So Uber had been very good at launching in many places at once. And one of their key milestones was when a user could open up their app, request a ride, and get picked up within 5 minutes of putting in a ride request. Now, if you think about that milestone, that involves a lot of different departments. That involves the product team and engineering needing to change the app to local mapping and change the language on the app. It involved local regulatory and getting permission to operate in the market. It also had local operations. You had to have enough drivers that were driving around to be able to be there in 5 minutes. And so when you create these custom milestones that help sort of trigger that next step, it helps put a little bit more structure and set progress as you're expanding. So, as mentioned, AI can be a really great tool to be able to help in this process. And what I'm talking about in particular is that pressure that often comes from the C level and the board. So I think it's very hard to get rid of that pressure because the top leadership makes a decision. We are going to launch in this market. Let's go. And so being able to be more effective and not as reactive is really the best choice. And so it's very hard to take 6 months to evaluate a market to truly understand what localizations are needed to be successful. So what's more effective is to get that understanding you need. And that's where AI can be really, really effective in that. And when you're looking at a source to help guide you through this market discovery process in particular, often you're thinking you'd want someone with three things. One, knowledge of the local market. Two, experts, like a network of people to talk to better understand the market and ask your specific questions. And then three is some kind of structure so that you're not leaving things out, only learning them when you're in market, and then needing to be reactive like a lot of companies are to fix things where a lot of time and money gets wasted. And so AI can be a great tool with that. As an example, the platform that we're building, globalcopilot.com, Global Copilot, is essentially this copilot that helps guide you through the whole process. And eventually, we're building a solution that does everything end to end, from evaluating markets and deciding on markets to building strategy to actually launching and reaching product market fit. But what we've decided to start focusing on is this customer discovery piece, to provide all of that information to you on the front end so you can understand how you need to localize, but still stick to the timeline that leadership is pressing for to launch in a market. And to those points, there's a lot of data sources that we bring in, both proprietary and otherwise, to give insights about all aspects of the market. Think about that spider chart and all of the go-to-market and operational nuances. We also have a network of over 1,000 experts who you can ask questions to, who understand core elements, specifics around a regulation, specifics around your industry. And then we provide that methodology and structure that I've been talking about earlier to help you. So it becomes much better than just endlessly typing hundreds and hundreds of questions into ChatGPT. And so, I think I'd love to open things up for questions. Would love to see what you want to talk about. And in general, about international expansion and around how AI can help you with it as well.
Don't be shy, no worries. We're not gonna bite you. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, much better now.
Okay, awesome. So, yeah, I was saying that don't be shy. We're not gonna bite you. Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for this for the talk. Well, on my side, I did put some points out there
Mhm.
about the some things that you were mentioning. For example, is you mentioned that first thing is we have to know our client. We know to know the market that we're going to be expanding to. That is one of the things that I think is most important before trying to expand. In the part of, you have to have metrics in every milestone that we're going to be doing. I think that's really important because we cannot expand to the whole world if we're not able to learn what is the basic of the first part that we know about. We have to know about. So I think that's really important to know on our side. And another thing is the AI. I mean, right now, everything, as you mentioned, we are asking everything to ChatGPT. So I think it is really important to have something on our side that helps us to expand, helps us to learn what's going on our market. So that's really great. Um,
Yeah, if I can make a couple points. So,
mhm.
yeah, it's understanding the source of things is really important, and that's why, like, at Global Copilot, we share the source with you so you can actually see it and evaluate whether you think it's good or not. A second thing that's really important is you got to think about expanding to new markets as a muscle that you're building. We talked about like the stark differences between some big markets. Well, if you attempt to jump from, a very inaccessible market to where you are now, from where you are now, it really can hurt your ability to be effective in your expansion because you need to build that muscle. You need to learn. And a great way to help build that muscle is to not reinvent the wheel every time you go into a market and do things from the beginning. And I think that's why what we found in our research and the ecosystem that exists that can support you in expanding internationally is that there's an expertise that these service providers have. And like Serviap Global, as an example, has a lot of great market expertise. So you can go to them and look for support instead of having to go learn everything yourself, by doing a bunch of searches on ChatGPT or otherwise. And so plugging into experts and doing that market discovery beyond just desk research is really important. And so leveraging those partners that you can build to be with you through the whole journey to go from market to market to market can help you really build your momentum and not make mistakes in different markets.
Yes, thanks. I think I'm gonna be asking our CEO to send us to another country to learn about it, before expanding.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, I don't know if someone else in the audience has any more questions or comments.
It looks like there's a hand up. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Aaron,
Okay.
I sent you one. I remember we discussed this with Klaus in our
Mhm.
webinar, in our podcast, in our last episode. He mentioned the DocuSign experience in Japan. I
Yes.
think that may be something very interesting for you to go over because it is an example of how you can overcome cultural nuances in global expansion. So if you can tell us a little bit more about that case, that would be great.
Absolutely. So as mentioned when we talked about the global class mindset versus the legacy mindset, the legacy mindset is very much we are going to do things the company way. And a great example of that early on in their growth was actually Uber. So Uber said, kind of famously, they're essentially saying we're going to ask for forgiveness, not permission. We're going to take our model and shove it down the throat of every city in this world, and whatever happens, happens. And they were not successful in a number of places, like China, like Indonesia, like Philippines, other places, because they didn't take an interest and understanding of the cultural nuance as much as they should. And so it's about finding the local way of doing things. And Uber learned this later in their expansion when they expanded and they wanted to focus on the Middle East. They acquired a company called Kareem, and they allowed the company to keep its own branding and some of its own local way of operating. To get to the DocuSign example, that's a great example of the global class mindset. So, for those who haven't done business in Japan, they don't actually have a handwritten signature system. They have this centuries old system of Hanko stamps. And so there's a little stamp, and that signifies a signature, which was, part of what DocuSign was doing. So if DocuSign had taken that, Uber approach, they would have said, "Oh, this Hunko thing is a thing of the past. We're the future. We're here to disrupt." But they understood the cultural significance, so they actually partnered with a company called Shachihata. Shachihata is not a tech company. They literally make inks and they make like inks and stamps, and they partnered with them to create a digital Hanko, and that gave DocuSign such cultural credibility that they took off and were very successful in the market. Even though they partnered with a non-tech company, gave away a little bit of economics, but that cultural significance was really important, and that really helped them be successful in the market.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. We have a comment from Victor. I think it's something related to what you have mentioned right now. Says, "Great talk, Aaron. I once saw a company that incorporated in a country because it had a major project there, but in less than 2 years, it left because the project ended and they couldn't secure any more projects that would allow them to stay in the country. How often do you see this happen, and could they have acquired a company instead?"
Absolutely. So this type of thing happens all the time. So basically, that's why you want to understand the market fully. You also want to use the right partners to help you go through that process early on to understand the market and understand if it merits um, long-term investment in that country. And so basically, um, in the example that you're using, this would be a great opportunity to work with service provider partners. So instead of committing as much to creating the own entity, you can use employee of record type services and otherwise to help work through that first initial project and then decide whether it's worth building the team and continuing on from there. And so, um, and so this type of thing definitely happens all the time. I think acquiring a company could be an even larger commitment. And so I don't necessarily think you should necessarily just jump to doing that. As opposed, I guess what I'm suggesting is what we label as the using what we call the global agile model. So it's taking some of those agile principles, but not doing every market independently and then hitting that wall, but sort of thinking at a high level. Let's think about the complexity in this market. Let's understand it. Let's figure out the most direct way to test out the market, to test out our hypotheses of how we would operate in that market and go from there. And so you can do that with that major project, use other resources in the ecosystem that exist before committing to fully incorporating or to acquiring a company before you truly understand the market opportunity and the accessibility of that market and your ability to win with that market. Let me know if that answers your question, Victor. Other questions?
Okay, I don't know, guys. Do you have any other questions? Yes, we. Oh, Victor says sure.
Cool.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I see. Thanks, Victor.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, guys, any more questions? I think not. Well, on behalf of Serviap Global, I want to sincerely thank you, Aaron, for the time you have taken to talk about in this seminar and sharing your valuable insights. We truly appreciate your contributions. And to our audience, before we conclude, I want to thank you as well. And if you want to continue the conversation, please don't hesitate to getting in touch with us. We look forward to connecting with you once again. Okay, thank you. I don't know if there's any last words before we conclude this seminar. Okay, I think not. Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for your time. Thank you,
Awesome.
guys.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
Aaron. Thank you,
Thanks.
Kari.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.